Now, 2 days ago, the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, announced a new loan facility for the Pacific to help create infrastructure development there. It would be part of Labor's initiatives if they are elected at the next federal election, and reflects a larger concern about a more competitive environment for strategic influence in the Pacific, but also beyond in Asia. And to help us understand and to contextualise the geostrategic situation which Australian foreign policy makers are now facing, and to situate the official aid program within that geostrategic context, we've got a very exciting panel. It's my great pleasure to invite to the stage Dr. Sarah Cook, Director of the Institute for Global Development at the University of New South Wales. As you know, Dr. Cook has just started in her role 2 days ago and flown from Europe, where she has been most recently Director of UNICEF's Office of Research in Ascenti, and before that, Director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva. She's a China specialist and has been researching China's economic and social reforms and policy for 30 years. She is being joined by Professor John Blaxland, Director of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute and Head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. And for those of you that pick up a copy of today's Fin Review, you'll see an opinion piece on exactly this topic by John on soft power and the aid program. Dr. Denghua Zhang is ANU Research Fellow researching on international relations, Chinese foreign policy, foreign aid and trilateral aid cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. And Dr. Amrita Malhi is ACFID's Development Economics Advisor, where she works on climate change, human security and development futures. And she's also a visiting fellow at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at ANU. I'm particularly grateful for John and Denghua, who, due to flight shenanigans, had to get up at 4 a.m. to get here for their presentation this morning from Canberra, so thank you. But over to you, Sarah.
Good morning and thank you. And welcome to this panel on interest, values and influence. And thank you for the warm introductions. So I don't need to say much more, but I just wanted to set the scene for this panel before handing it over to our amazing group of speakers. And to thank ACFID for inviting me to chair this panel. My own research on China's has been focused over more than 30 years on China's economic and social transformation. Now we often speak of China's rise, but that wasn't so obvious 30 years ago. We've seen as a development community, we've really celebrated that success as a development model, as something, you know, to be shared and emulated. But of course, now we're at a stage where that rise also creates challenges and poses challenges in terms of, to some extent, threatening the status quo, and particularly in this region. It's upsetting our multipolar world balance that we're accustomed to. China, you know, is not the only focus of today's panel, but it's central to the key questions that we're talking about here. The issues of concern about how Australia engages in this shifting power balance and how it responds to these changing interests in your region. And of course, what this means, particularly for the development sector, the sector that, and the values that this sector holds, which is the subject of this conference. I think in this context, you're probably much more aware than I am that Australia's foreign policy obviously has to respond to this, and it's recognized this role of soft power and wants to explore more the role of soft power. So in its white paper, it talked about you know, how to respond and has commissioned also a soft power review. Its definition, I think, is useful to spell out. It defines, the white paper defines soft power as the ability to influence the behavior and thinking of others through the power of attraction and ideas. Soft power assets include a nation's education institutions, its aid program, its tourism assets and economic strength, as well as elements of national identity such as lifestyle and culture. I think we're both here, we're in an education institution with many of us representing education institutions, and of course primarily we're here to discuss the aid sector. So two of the key national assets, soft power assets. So I think we're going to hear now from the three speakers in turn from different perspectives about the more security end of China's interests in the region and what this means for Australia, a bit more from China's perspective of their development activities in the region, and then some reflections from the development sector ACFID perspective. So you've already been introduced to each of the panelists. They'll have about 10 minutes, and then we hope that you'll all want to engage with them on a topic that really is of core concern to us all in this sector. So thank you for this opportunity, and welcome first Professor John Blaxland from ANU. We have a strong Canberra representation here today, so welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour and a privilege to be here with you, and I'm delighted that ACFID and Mark and the team have invited me to participate. It's great for us and the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU to collaborate with ACFID. I think there's a really useful dynamism that emerges from the cooperation. Hold on to your seats, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to race through a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, okay? So first of all, we need to avert catastrophe. And there's a whole spectrum of challenges that we are confronting. This is not just about China. And you guys, you know this. I'm just bringing them all together in one slide. But you can see there's a growing urgency for us collectively to think through holistically the ramifications of the challenges we face. And that's really important for us to do. And hopefully this conference will be a significant boost to the momentum in that process. So my geostrategic SWOT analysis starts with this internal strengths, and I'm not going to dwell on them because you know them, right? We've got a very strong natural resources base, we've got a very strong economy, we've got a fantastic workforce, relatively speaking. We've got a defence force that is honed, high-tech, but boutique, like it's not that huge, but it's pretty darned impressive. And when you compare it to other countries, it's pretty small, but we like to think it's one of the best. We're an island continent, one of the reasons why we have such a small boutique ADF. We've been very fortunate where we live to have no land borders driving domestic border security concerns of that nature. And we leverage our access to US technology through the alliance with the United States, and through the interoperability that has enabled us, basically, many pundits would agree, spend 2% on GDP rather than 4% of GDP on defence. So that's a pretty good deal in anybody's terms. Internally, we've got a number of weaknesses, though. We're complacent about security and our place in the world. We've got a she'll be right attitude that helps breed a narcissistic and toxic political culture where people are so self-absorbed, they think they can get away with anything and the economy in their country will just bubble along. And so far, they've been kind of right, haven't they? We have. But who knows? The future may not be like that. We have infrastructure problems and pressures and uneven population distribution. And I'm sorry that you have to live in Sydney, folks, because in Canberra, I've got a 10-minute commute. We also have issues about oil refinery and access. We depend almost exclusively on refined oil from Singapore and South Korea. Human-made or natural disasters could easily disrupt that. We have remarkable powered vulnerabilities and underdeveloped solar, nuclear and hydro power options for a country that exports uranium. We're complete NIMBYs. We don't take it back, even though we're the most stable continent in the world. Go figure. That is just gobsmacking in my view. We have extraordinary cyber vulnerabilities. We've gone from being web-enabled to web-dependent and therefore web-vulnerable. And in this day and age, that makes for a number of significant challenges. Now, looking to the external opportunities, we have significant ones in the Southwest Pacific, relating to climate, resources and social challenges, which provide fantastic openings. This is the silver lining to the dark cloud, if you like, of what's happening in the Southwest Pacific. In the Association of Southeast Asian Nations space, we tend to disaggregate this organisation, but when we do aggregate it, we realise it's our third largest trading partner. It's 625 million people. It's $2.5 trillion economy, and it's our immediate neighbour. And yet we skip over it to think about China, India and other places. We need to think about this. It's got to be more in our frontal lobe, I would put to you. Of course, we know about the relations with with South Korea, Japan and China in Northeast Asia. They're well understood, and I don't need to dwell on that here. But of course, there are some issues arising about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well as the Belt Road Initiative, about whether or not this is a crisis or an opportunity, or is it a bit of both? And that's obviously something we need to talk about. In the Indian Ocean Rim Association is something Australia's engaged in. We're seeing the development of relations, particularly with India, and prospects for collaboration there with India are growing as well. Let alone the rest of the world, we're seeing a remarkable renewed interest in our neck of the woods from Britain and France, amongst others, with France having enduring presence in the Pacific, as we know, although contentious and subject to plebiscites coming up, of course, and the Brits with Brexit looking around for friends anywhere else, even though they walked away from us in 1973. Go figure. And then, of course, there's the question of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. If we get, in the next generation, a 2, 3, dare I say 4 or 5 degree rise in global temperatures, what happens here? Does that white go green? And does our green go brown? I don't know. But nobody's talking about it. Why the hell not? These are big issues. China's certainly very actively engaged in that space. We claim 40% of Antarctica. You wouldn't know it because of the way we act. So there are external threats, foreign interference, cyber attack, industrial, military, state and non-state actors busily engaging. The ANU has had a cyber attack only recently. We've got a transactional retreat from ideational leadership from the United States. The United States used to be the light on the hill. What the hell's going on? What is Trump doing? What does the United States want? And what is it going to do when it retreats from trade, international bodies and agreements that are about building the fabric of international society? These are deeply unsettling developments, ladies and gentlemen. We've also got religiously and politically motivated violence affecting our neighbourhood, not just the Middle East, but Marawi and Philippines and Indonesia, and of course domestically in Australia. It's manifested itself multiple times, but not nearly on the scale of what we've seen abroad. Then of course, I mean, the other ones pale compared to this one, conventional or nuclear war. And my colleague Brendan Taylor at the SDSC wrote this book, 4 Flashpoints, talking about the prospects and their tangible prospects of war on the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, East China Sea and South China Sea. Are you getting a little bit kind of blue yet? I'm struggling to see the world as a glass half full, but I remain an eternal optimist, but I like to have my eyes open. Then we have the issue about large-scale unregulated people movement. About 3 years ago, nearly 4 now, about 100,000 Rohingya fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh. Many of them got on boats, generated an enormous political challenge for maritime Southeast Asia and Australia, many of whom are still in Manus and Nauru. There's now 700,000 in camps in Bangladesh. If only a fraction of them get on boats, we are in as deep, if not deeper, predicament than we were back then. We need collective action to operate in this space, to help the Rohingya people address the challenges they face. So we need to think about this in terms of national interest, self-interest, and altruism. It's a combination of factors, ladies and gentlemen, but collective action is required. Then there's the issue of potential breakdown in relations with Indonesia. We've had a game of snakes and ladders when it comes to our relationship with Indonesia. We incrementally get up the ladder and then down the snake we come again. Why? Because we poke them in the eye over beef, boats, spies, clemency, Papua, Timor, you name it. Do you think they're starting to not like us very much? I wonder why. What's going on there? Now, thankfully, some efforts are being put in place, but they're limited, and we need to do a lot more in that space. It's a very contentious and difficult one, of course, because we're like oil and water. Their culture is so different, their values are different, but we've got to make it work somehow. Then, of course, there's the issue I touched on before. In the Southwest Pacific, we've got some existential challenges relating to governance, relating to climate change, and relating to geostrategic great power contestation. Australia needs to do a lot more in this space. We're seeing the government doing some things. We're seeing the opposition coming up with some visionary ideas. I think we need to go even further. I think we need to come up with a grand bargain for the Pacific. A grand bargain, ladies and gentlemen, where we actually come up with a reciprocal arrangement where we reach out with a degree of altruism and self-interest as we think about the challenges they face, the growing challenges they face, the prospects for them worsening, and for them having a dire effect on us if we don't generously stand up with a visionary outlook on what the future holds and how we can help them and we can work together. And then there's the issue of diminished biodiversity and prospect of pandemics. So I'm sorry, I hope you're not looking to a warm bath yet with a razor blade, because that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm really just trying to give you a balanced sense of the challenges, the spectrum of challenges we face, and opportunities. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, a long list of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that will hopefully inform your deliberations of what you can do to think through these issues and constructively engage on them. And I've got a couple of suggestions. Firstly, that the challenge is not all about China. The full spectrum of factors come into play in terms of risks, threats, peace, and prospects of war. We're living in very interesting times, ladies and gentlemen, and I use that term euphemistically. And I know that ACFID is not a security-oriented sector, but to work best, I put to you, ACFID really must understand the geostrategic dynamics at work. You can't be blind to what's happening in terms of realpolitik and the other issues at stake here. Geopolitics intersects with development and aid. We hear nowadays talk of hard power, of smart power, of sharp power, and we've been working on the issue of soft power. We need to think outside the box. We need to think creatively. We need to work together, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. As somebody who arrived in Australia less than a week ago, this was an absolutely fabulous sort of introduction to all of the issues, the context, for this region. So really setting all the questions for today in a very broad perspective. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Denghua Zhang, also from ANU, who will talk more about China and its role in the Pacific. Over to you. Okay.
So good morning, everyone. First of all, many thanks to the host for having me here. Thank you. And John has set the tone and talked about the geopolitics, and I'm going to approach the Australia and China in Asia-Pacific from another perspective, and that's about the potential areas for cooperation. And so in the next 10 minutes, I will help you go through 3 areas. First is about Chinese foreign policy and foreign aid in the Pacific. The second is about an overall picture of Chinese trilateral aid cooperation. So by trilateral aid cooperation, I mean the project which involves China as an emerging donor, then one traditional donor, and then a recipient country. And the last part is about some prospects for Australian, China, Pacific Island countries aid cooperation in the future. So at present, the Chinese government has released 2 white papers on foreign aid. And if we compare these 2 white papers, we can see some of the features of Chinese foreign aid spending in recent years. First is that there has been an impressively rapid growth of Chinese foreign aid spending in recent years. So you can see that Chinese foreign aid spending in the 3 years between 2010 and 2012 actually accounts for more than 1/4 of Chinese foreign aid spending in the previous 6 decades. The second feature is that there has been significant changes in Chinese aid components. So Chinese foreign aid includes 3 components. One is the grants, the second is interest-free loan, the third is concessional loan or soft loan. So we can see that in recent years, the proportion of the grant aid has maintained, and the proportion of interest-free loans has been reduced significantly, which accounts for less than 10% of Chinese foreign aid in total. And the concessional loan has become the large component of Chinese foreign aid spending, which now accounts for more than half of Chinese foreign aid. And this is about the geographical distribution of Chinese foreign aid spending. And you can see that Africa and Asia continue to be the 2 largest recipients of Chinese foreign aid in recent years. And moving to the Pacific, Chinese foreign aid to the Pacific Island countries accounted for roughly 4% of Chinese foreign aid. In the past 10 years, the Chinese government has significantly increased its political and economic investment in the region. And there are 3 most important events. The first event took place in April 2006, when the first meeting of the China-Pacific Island Countries Economic Development Cooperation Forum was held in Fiji. So the gentleman here was the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, and this was his first visit to the Pacific region. And during the visit, he announced a number of measures, that is foreign aid measures, for Pacific Island countries. And one of the most important one is about the 3 billion Chinese RMB in concessional loans to the region in the next 3 years. And also he promised that the Chinese government will provide 2,000 training opportunities to candidates from the island countries over the next 3 years. So this is the first important event. The second event took place in November 2013. That's when the second foreign meeting was held in Chinese city Guangzhou. And during the meeting, the Chinese government promised that they will provide 1 billion Chinese concessional loans to the island countries. And over the next 4 years, together with another 1 billion commercial loans for infrastructure development in the region. And also, he announced that Beijing will provide 2,000 short-term training slots for Pacific Island countries. So this is the second most important event. The third and most recent one took place in November 2014, when the Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Fiji, and this is also the first visit by a Chinese president in history. And during his group meeting with the leaders of the region, both sides, they promised that they are going to establish a strategic partnership. And also, the Chinese government invited the Pacific Island countries to benefit from Chinese economic development, including encouraging the Pacific Island countries to join the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And also, another important measure is that China will provide 2,000 government scholarships and 5,000 short-term training opportunities for the island countries over the next 5 years. So these are the 3 most important events in the past 10 years. Some of the recent developments, first is that there's going to be an upcoming China-Pacific Island Country Summit in Port Moresby in early November before APEC. Second is that Papua New Guinea has become the first Pacific Island country to sign up to Chinese Belt and Road when Prime Minister O'Neill visited Beijing in June this year. And also, as you are aware, that in recent years, the debates over China in the Pacific has been, has heated up. The second topic of my presentation is about a new area, that is the trilateral aid cooperation between China, and traditional donors. Here I have two tables to share with you. So it is very interesting that despite the significant differences between China as an emerging donor and the traditional donors, in recent years, the two sides, they have conducted a growing number of trilateral aid projects. So this table is about Chinese trilateral aid cooperation with traditional donor states. So here we can see that China has conducted trilateral aid cooperation with donor states such as United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia and New Zealand, and the Netherlands. This table is about the Chinese trilateral aid cooperation with the UN agencies, especially UNDP, which has been a pioneer in promoting Chinese trilateral aid cooperation in recent years. So the two sides, they have conducted 6 trilateral aid projects in recent years. This one is about the first trilateral aid project between China and Australia, malaria control in Papua New Guinea, which started in 2016 and for a duration of 3 years. And from Australian side, they mainly contributed for $4 million Australian dollars to support the project. From the Chinese side, they mainly provide they mainly dispatch the Chinese Chinese experts to work in Port Moresby. And yeah, in Port Moresby. The prospects for potential trilateral aid cooperation between China and the traditional donor states, including Australia. First, that is about the political mistrust, which are still profound. The second is about those practical, technical challenges or obstacles. For example, the two sides, Chinese foreign aid and the traditional ODA, they are so different in terms of both aid policies and also aid practices on the ground. The third obstacle is the reservation of the officials in recipient countries. And another important factor in Chinese trilateral aid cooperation with traditional donors in the future is the recently established Chinese new aid agency. They call it the China International Development Cooperation Agency. This one was established in April this year. And its impact on Chinese foreign aid delivery and trilateral aid cooperation is to be observed. Before I conclude, some policy recommendations for Chinese trilateral aid cooperation between traditional donors such as Australia in the Pacific overseas, including the Pacific region. First is that in order to promote the trilateral aid cooperation, they need to sustain the support from both governments. Second, they need to strengthen the role of recipient countries in promoting and in initiating the trilateral aid projects. Third, it is important to have the full support from resident ambassadors from both sides, both the Chinese ambassadors on the ground and the traditional donors ambassadors on the ground. And another recommendation is that they need to learn the lessons from the current pilot projects. And the fifth part, the advice is that they need to continue to focus on those less sensitive areas, or what we can call the low-hanging fruit. And the last one is that they need to aim high and pilot high-level aid cooperation in the future. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. I think it's really helpful to have some of the real evidence of what China is doing in this region. I think it also raised a lot of questions that maybe we'll come back to in terms of, how we interpret what's driving these activities, whether we see them as the areas where we could actually shape mutual interests to find this grand bargain around development in the region, or whether we see it as an assertion of sort of new forms of soft power that could threaten some of our interests. And I think these are all the debates and the language that we use to understand and interpret them that we really need to sort of grapple with a bit. And so now we turn to Dr. Amrita Malhi, who is also associated with ANU, but also with ACFID. And I think we'll talk a little bit more from the development sector's perspective on these really engaging issues. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now, the first thing I want to do is just thank our speakers again, because they've really been on quite an odyssey to come and join us today, so thanks again. Microphone up? Better? Okay. Now, I also want to say, some of you may have come to a fair few ACFID conferences, and the kinds of speakers that we've had on this panel aren't usually talking about bread and butter issues that come up at ACFID conferences. Now, the first by John Blaxland has outlined the range of factors that the Australian state needs to consider before it invests in development cooperation. And it shows us just exactly what the issues are that can crowd out our advocacy for more money for international aid. The second, by Denghua Zhang, has focused on China, which, depending on who you talk to, could be or already is the greatest adversary that Australia has ever faced. But it's great to actually have a bit more context about what China is actually doing, what its policy aims are, and potentially, the options that are out there for responding to what China's doing. At the same time, though, China really does loom large. I mean, John has told us, look, not everything's about China, but that doesn't mean that China isn't currently saturating every single discussion about Australian foreign policy at the moment. It is actually present in everything you might read. So the Australian government's foreign policy white paper, for example, is full of, explicit and implicit reference to China. So our analysis at ACFID is that we're going to have to live with this, and this China factor, the China threat, is starting to be present in discussions about development cooperation, not only what it does and what it's for, but also how it's financed, whether that's through grants or loans or blended finance or some combination of all of these modalities, and also the scope of its programs, the geographic area in which the aid program operates, and even the rationale for aid in the first place. And certainly all the international signals also point in this direction. It really is not simply an Australian paranoia, it is a much broader international scenario as well. This week, for example, we heard Labor's own announcement that it intends to facilitate concessional loans and establish an infrastructure investment bank for infrastructure projects in the Pacific. That's an Australian announcement, but it's not isolated. A couple of weeks ago, the United States passed the BUILD Act, which authorizes the creation of an international development finance institution with an exposure cap of $60 billion, doubling the amount available for development loans. This expansion of loan finance comes after an announcement made by the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in July, that the US would dedicate $113 million to economic engagement, and that amount at the time was largely dismissed as insufficient and too overtly tied to the language of balancing China, so it wasn't very warmly accepted in Southeast Asia, for example. There are similar initiatives in the works coming out of the EU. So, for example, they also announced €60 billion recently in infrastructure financing. They were also criticised as offering only too little too late. Regardless of the criticisms, both these announcements look like they're likely to leverage loan financing and private sector partners and blended finance instruments. Apparently, seemingly, like they're going to collectively put out a counter-offer to China's Belt and Road and their expansion of development financing around the world, not just in our region, but around the world, including in Africa, as Denghua showed. Since then, Japan has also announced its own sets of initiatives, and Singapore has announced that it also intends to actually become a development finance broker, which I think is quite an interesting development as well. So watching these international developments, as well as the announcement this week in Australia, it seems that debates around development cooperation, what we do it for, how we should pay for it, are shifting around us. They're shifting as we speak. And the role that China is playing in stimulating this shift is important for the sector to understand and respond to with some finesse. Now, we're a politically savvy and engaged and internationalist sector of the Australian economy, so it seems likely that we are going to have to shift our attention from simply advocating for an expansion of aid and development funding to conducting a more sophisticated argument about how it should be funded, what it's for, what projects are backed, and which development actors and finance modalities are backed and supported to participate. So for all of these reasons, ACFID has recently made quite a big push around the issue of soft power to respond to DFAT's soft power review, which it announced in line with its foreign policy white paper. And I should say that, debates around soft power and the national interest in an increasingly contested region are not always comfortable territory for NGOs and activists who insist that development, as they should, insist that development should be performed in line with the public good to address inequality and to promote human rights. At the same time, as much as these are the arguments that we make, we are an important foreign policy actor. We have a strong public support base. ACFID's members have nearly 5,000 employees, more than 23,000 domestic volunteers, and more than 2,000 overseas volunteers. We engage with more than 1.5 million donors, and we work in nearly 100 countries. Australian NGOs and their local partners are right there in the thick of the action in response to, for example, mass displacement of Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And this sort of work creates highly visible impacts. People can see it, and Australians are all pretty much aware of our role as a sector in leading this sort of work. We also do quieter work, and we're quite serious about it. NGOs are present in the less visible work of representing Australia and its values overseas. They're there in track 2 diplomatic forums, actively seeking to promote liberal democratic norms and values, such as human rights protection, which is the theme of this conference, along with gender transformative development, climate adaptation as a principle of development, and so on. Now, all this work, whether the Australian government supports it or not, is a moot point. Ultimately, the effects of it and the good impression that it creates accrues to Australia as a nation. Look only at an example that I can name from July this year. The International Women's Development Agency made a statement at the UN's high-level political forum on sustainable development. Now, this isn't, boots on the ground, but it's important foreign policy representation. In fact, our sector does so much to help Australia achieve its foreign policy aims that for the 6% of the Australian aid budget that our members receive, they actually deliver more than 18% of Australia's aggregate development results. This is according to DFAT's own Office for Development Effectiveness. So our members, and we as ACFID, are active in national and international debates about protecting and promoting values like human rights, gender equality, and climate adaptation. All of this accrues to Australia and its soft power value in the international arena. We're also innovative. We're packed with experts. And we're not the only ones who recognise this. Private sector development providers, for example, they all want to partner with NGOs, and they do. So just look at DFAT's business partnership platform. Almost every private sector recipient is teamed up with a local or international NGO. We capitalise on individual donations from households and people, Australians. So we actually turn a $4 billion aid program into a $5 billion aid program just with the fundraising work we do. And all of this is in ACFID's State of the Sector report, which I think has been mentioned at this conference already. And we're increasingly, well-connected, incredibly well-connected around Asia and the Pacific. So I guess the point I want to make around all of this, and in the context of the talks that John and Denghua have given us, is ultimately that the work we do delivers soft power benefits to Australia. On top of that, it's actually our non-government character, our civil society character, that helps Australia demonstrate its commitments to liberal values and democracy, whether it plans for or supports these benefits or not. So quite independently from the emerging debate about infrastructure competition and how to finance alternatives to China's Belt and Road, it is precisely the non-government character of NGOs that allows them to perform Australia's desired role of liberal democratic norm promotion and norm creation. Sometimes this happens in collaboration with government, sometimes it happens at odds with government, and it's precisely our capacity to do both that makes us able to walk the talk. So that commitment to defending and extending freedom, democracy, the rule of law, racial and gender equality, culturally sensitive advocacy, support for fairness, support for stability, we do this both in Australia and the international environments in which NGOs operate. So I guess, the main point of everything I've just been summarising here for you is to say that the work that NGOs do in all of these forums accrues to the image that Australia projects in the region and in the world. Australian NGOs are a critically important soft power asset, and the work we perform should be part of any emerging discussion about soft power, including how to respond to a contested region, challenges in the region, competitive aid offers, competitive infrastructure offers around the region. So to sum up, ACFID intends to do its bit to insert NGOs into these debates as they arise, and we encourage members to do the same and prepare for these debates assertively, as we will. So we have a clear message to contribute to these debates, and this echoes actually the Soft Power Review's emphasis on partnerships. Actually, one of the main terms of reference was about the potential for creating partnerships in the region. And this has to do with the very nature of soft power, namely its emphasis on attraction and influence. These qualities that we've talked about are cultivated by dynamic and enduring partnerships between people, precisely the kinds of partnerships that civil society organisations embody. So the organisations, the institutions that we work for are built on the back of mutual respect and trust, and rarely out of project funding or financial transactions alone. So we can have the debates about how to fund things. They're critical. We need to fund things. But we can also have the debate about actually what do we want to project in the region and in the world. And our primary motivation that we would argue for in terms of our development program should be a clear commitment to the development of our partners' needs and interests. Now, security concerns are real and influential in the current geopolitical environment. I think John made that very clear to us, that ultimately there are decisions that states need to make. But for our aid program to continue to work as a genuine soft power asset, our partners need to trust that our motivations are in their interests and that we are genuine partners for the long haul. And that's the argument that ACFID has made in the soft power review. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amrita. And I think now we've got, a very broad spectrum from the sort of big regional, but many of them global challenges that were laid out at the start, down to, what is the role of us in the sector in sort of engaging, particularly with the shifting balance of power that we see sometimes posed as a threat in the region, and the potential for insecurity, potentially securitization, potentially trade-off between the values that we're trying to share as a development community in the region. And I'm going to open it up. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. I hope there's some really sharp questions, either to the panel as a whole or to particular people. I see one hand at the back. Just to start, I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate and provoke, I hope, some discussion and more thinking among all of us, not necessarily just for the panel. But, if the reality of what we're aiming for with development is development in terms of wealthier societies, economic growth, as well as a certain set of values, we're seeing the success of certain rising powers, and we've got China, but we've also got others in this region, in Asia, more broadly, South Asia, and across the world, who are going to inevitably, by their rise, threaten, to some extent, the status quo. That should be, to some extent, a measure of success of what we're doing, but of course it also threatens some of our interests and values. How do we respond to this? Where can we find those norms and shared interests and values? And I think one of the issues you might want to reflect on also, as you talk, Amrita, about the increasing investments in infrastructure by US, Australia, others, this has been a gap that the development community sort of left open. We didn't invest significantly in infrastructure for quite a significant period of time, and realized post-financial crisis that this was a big gap in the development. This is China's strength, to come and actually work in that space, whereas probably there may be other strengths and potential for mutual synergies between what we're doing across different developments, or in the trilateral or multilateral cooperation space. So I think they're all things that we also as a community need to reflect on, where we've dropped the ball over the last decade, 2 decades, and how we're coming back in the development space. So my first hand I saw was back there. Please say who you are and ask a clear, succinct question. I'll take 2 or 3 and then come back to the panel to respond. Do you want to take this one?
Good morning. My name is Daisy. I have a question for Professor Blaxland from ANU University. You mentioned that Australia into the future will need to consider our energy needs, and that's absolutely correct. You mentioned solar as being one of the answers, and I can see that we need to develop that industry a lot further. You mentioned the untapped potential of Australian uranium. I just wanted to ask, in your considerations about uranium and uranium mining, to what extent do you take into consideration research from Stanford University and widespread academic research about the environmental and social hazards of uranium in terms of the tailings dams, which often are known to seep heavy metals and radioactive waste into the groundwater, which we've also seen in the Northern Territory around Kakadu National Park. And secondly, the fact that Australian uranium was being used at Fukushima in Japan when the disaster occurred, and the communities around that site are still not able to go back to their homes. And how do these impacts, how do you consider these in your future thinking?
Great. Can I just take two more questions? I think the two that I saw were here and here. I don't know if there were others that other people saw. If so, put your hand up. And then we'll come back to all the panelists to respond to the questions.
Thank you. Sana Mandolini, as you were speaking about the question of soft power and the China approach, I think what we have to also understand is that for 17 years, led by the US, but essentially the Western world has been entirely focused on countering terrorism, countering violent extremism. We spent $2 trillion. Essentially, our space as the Western world has been militarized, securitized presence around the world with a big stick over people's heads. And how much legitimacy do we have, number one? Number two, China has entered the space in terms of their interests. And frankly, Saudi Arabia has also done a brilliant job at their soft power as well, spreading Wahhabism, and we can't ignore that. It's all over the place. They've got universities. They're erasing local culture in many places. But how we deal with this is that we need to actually stop the conversations in the Western context, CVE, PVE, CT, all this nonsense, and actually say, what are we for? What do we stand for? Because countering stuff isn't really a positive way to engage the world, right? So I think the Western world has actually lost its direction and its own sense of what it represents and what it wants for the world. And we are against terrorism, that's fine. But what are we actually for? What are we offering the rest of the world? We haven't done that in 17 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, one more from the back, yeah.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Christian Nielsen from Live and Learn. We work extensively in the Pacific, and we've seen the immense pain that concessional loans are giving Pacific Island governments, especially when it's time to pay them back. We see countries like Tonga and Vanuatu are faced with huge debt crises from these loans, and I know they're provided by a lot of governments, but since we are very much talking about China, I'm keen to hear what mechanisms China will use to recover the money once Pacific Island countries are defaulting on their loans. And will this include laying claim on Pacific Islands' natural resources?
Okay, I've got one question here, one at the back, and then we have to come back to the panel and wrap this up. So please be brief.
Thank you. My name's Matt Tinkler. I'm from Save the Children. Thanks for the panel, really engaging debate. My question is whether international NGOs like Save the Children and others should be accepting aid from China directly. Is it happening in your knowledge so far? And if so, what are the implications for us? Can we shape China's aid program for the better? How will traditional donors like DFAT and others react?
Thank you. And the back?
My name is Habib. I'm a member of Rohingya community. So my question to Dr. Denghua. So I know that you have done a lot of research on China foreign aid. So can you explore a little bit about how China has been distributing aid on the ground for Burma? For example, we have oil and gas project in Lower Burma. There is 3 oil and gas project, and oil and gas project again in Arakan Bay. So along the pipeline, so there has been massive displacement and forced labor, and so how China as a leader nation and big economic countries and having multi-billion-dollar investment in Burma, how take responsibility for the victim, those being displaced and those being faced because of China investment. Again, as you see, where Rohingya people has been more than 700,000 displaced around the Mondo and Buthidaung region, and there we are seeing mega Chinese investment in there as well. So how you say and how do you respond regarding this? Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a lot of issues put on the table, which I think reflect a lot of the concerns of the sector here. I'm going to start with John, then Denghua, then Amrita, to respond either to the specific questions or pick up a couple of the more general points. We don't have a huge amount of time. For longer discussions, there will be a coffee break. So over to John.
Look, thank you. I'm not a uranium expert. I note that we in Australia export it, but we won't take it back. It's really selfish. If we're going to export it, why the hell aren't we taking ownership of the full cycle? Otherwise, don't export it. But we as a nation do. We're one of the biggest exporters in the world, and we don't own the problem that we are generating. So individuals may object, but I'm sorry, we as a nation have made it happen for decades, and we don't own it, and it's irresponsible, in my opinion. Having said that, and I say I'm not an expert on this, but I have read a bit, and I understand there are options, such as thorium and other options that are far less risky than the approaches to nuclear power generation that were developed for Fukushima. But once again, I'm not an expert on that. I'm just saying this is something that is not talked about, and it should be, and we should own our mess. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay. So my response to 3 questions. The first is about, the third question, that's about the Chinese loans and the debt issues. So what will Chinese government do if the receiving countries default on the repayment? And I think some points. First is that for the Chinese concessional loans, there is some misperception among some officials in the receiving countries that once these loans are mature and they cannot repay, and they thought that they can persuade the Chinese government to turn these concessional loans into either into grants or into interest-free loans and to write them off. But actually, this is a misperception. So for concessional loans, the first point is that they need to be paid back. The second, what will the Chinese government do if the receiving countries really cannot make the repayment? Recently, I have a chat with a former Chinese official from the China Export and Import Bank, and his response is that if the receiving country, if the recipient countries approach the Chinese side and said they are not able to make the repayment, normally the Chinese side, especially the China Export Bank, we are trying to persuade these countries to try their best to make the repayment, because if they really cannot repay the loans, the Chinese Exim Bank will lower. This will trigger the internal alarm within the China Exim Bank, and they will lower the rating of this country, which will affect all kinds of Chinese loans, either concessional or commercial, to this country. And also, I think when the loans are mature, there are some room. There are some room or space. First is that maybe the Chinese side and the receiving countries, they can negotiate about the postpone of the repayment. For example, in the Tongan case, it was postponed for another 5 years. Second, there are some options for the refinancing. So this is the first question, and the second is about whether the NGOs can shape Chinese foreign aid. My perception is very, very difficult, because for Chinese foreign aid practice, it's mainly a government-to-government practice, and the role for NGOs in this process, I think, is quite limited. And unless, I think, the NGOs in Australia, they approach the Australian government and trying to have the impact on the Australian government side rather than the Chinese side. And the final question is about the aid practice in Myanmar, right? Yeah. In Myanmar, about those environmental issues and the human displacement. Actually, this is not the focus of my research area. My research focuses on Chinese foreign aid policy and foreign aid, mainly in the Pacific region. But I understand that when China provides foreign aid to the recipient countries, I think they focus less on those aspects such as the human rights and democracy or financial and economic reforms. And they said the Chinese aid attach no strings or less strings. But personally, I think the government can do more in these two areas. But in some cases, there's also an issue of what we call the principle and agency dilemma. That is, the government may have good policies on those environmental issues and also on those human issues, but for those Chinese contracts, such as NGOs, maybe they do not implement these policies. Yeah, and I remember some scholars, they have written about these issues about Chinese aid practices in African countries. They call this as the principle and agency dilemma. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Amrita.
Okay, well, I want to take up a couple of broad questions, including the ones that Sarah raised. And I see that we only have 2 minutes remaining, so I'm responding as well to the sign. Look, the question of development is a really important one. I mean, when we talk about development, we are actually talking about post-colonial nations' sovereign development, from impoverished, formerly colonial or semi-colonial nations to nations that can actually threaten the status quo. And in fact, we've got into this position where we're talking about threats to the status quo precisely because nations have successfully developed. It doesn't mean that when they develop, they're going to not be threatening, and we can't really control that. And so now the language of threat is almost like a response to precisely the kinds of development that we'd like to see, where people are able to own their direction, even if that direction doesn't please us. And that is a complicated thing that we need to be able to respond to with some sophistication, including, for example, this question about whether we can help shape what China does with its development program. As Denghua has said, we're probably going to be more likely to be able to do it if we approach the Australian government so that there can be a government-to-government discussion about these things, and that discussion will presumably need to consider what are we going to do about mass displacement? What are we going to do about loans? Are we actually going to counter those loans with our loans? If they're doing debt diplomacy, then are we going to also do debt diplomacy? I think there are very big questions that we need to ask around the future of development financing and the future of the kinds of programs that we're going to see. As for infrastructure, I'd be the last person on earth to say developing nations don't need infrastructure, especially if it's climate adaptive infrastructure. Then we've got, then we're really cooking with gas, aren't we? Where people are able to have hospitals, roads, airports that aren't going to sink under the sea, productive economic capacity that's going to raise people out of poverty and situations of inequality in those pockets, even in increasingly wealthy nations around Southeast Asia, for example, and the Pacific. There are pockets of extreme poverty. There are middle classes that we talk about as the future of Australia's economic success, right, because they're going to fund our ongoing wealth. But actually they're in a situation of relative precarity. If they fall back into poverty, the whole development story actually starts to reverse. So I'm certainly not going to say they shouldn't have roads, bridges, and they, I think it's absolutely fine for us to engage there. I think the question is then, how do we impart the kinds of values and the soft power benefits that we like to think that we produce for Australia and that we do produce for Australia? How do we engage in a discussion about those things at the same time as responding to developing nations' infrastructure needs? And I think part of the key to that is talking about climate change and climate adaptation. And let's see how that discussion pans out. I think these are just absolutely great questions, and they're kind of about the direction of the world and the direction of the region. And it's our place, actually, to join in those discussions. So I hope we can take those discussions further. We'll see how it pans out.
Thank you. Well, I think we've come to the end of this session. I'd really like to thank the excellent speakers, really great presentations. This is clearly the beginning of a conversation about a really critical issue. It's not going to go away. Nothing here is solved. It's going to be evolving. There are things we have to do. And so we hope the conversation will continue in the coffee break over the next day and then into the future and with ACFID and all its partners. So thank you to everybody and congratulations.
Thank you, Sarah, Denghua, Amrita and John, for a fascinating race through our changing strategic environment. And for those of you that work with partners in China, I know Anglican Board of Mission have been working with Amnesty Foundation for many years, and of course organisations like WWF and Oxfam have had country programs there for many years too. But in the next decade, there's going to be much more Chinese civil society going out into the world doing development work, working. So the opportunities to partner and collaborate are large, and we'd be very interested to hear about any of our members that are working with Chinese partners in cooperating, because I think that could be a feature of next year's conference. So thank you again, Sarah, and panel. Oh. Round of applause for our panelists. Wonderful. Thanks, John. Thanks for going the extra mile at such an early hour. Thank you, Amrita. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before you all rush off, hold it. You're not out of not to play lunch yet. I just wanted to invite Raywin and Chris and Max from OSCE up onto the stage. I mentioned yesterday at the AGM that we did our first State of the Sector report, which builds on quite many years of doing statistical surveys with you, but we actually really plunged into, well, what does this mean? Let's go further into what the data can show us. We released that report in hard copy. It's on our website earlier this year, but just wanted to preview the website that we are launching next week. It'll be up on our website, and it's been put together by Chris and Max and Ken and Mark at OSCE, but it has really interesting data in it that should be very useful to you in your discussion with your boards and also with your staff. So, for example, the average donation size for organisations, so for large NGOs, it's about $450. A medium-sized NGO, it's about $750. For a small NGO, it's about $1,700. So interesting. The changing percentages of spending on fundraising across the sector by size of organisation. You can see large there going up to 10%, 5% for medium, and 2% for smalls. The difference by capital cities and regions, rural areas, in terms of donations by state and territory across Australia. The spend on aid and development per staff member. So this has been very useful information that you've provided us. We've also gone to Australian Charities Not-for-Profit Commission data and ATO records, so we're able to sort of cut and look at things differently, but across the sector, so you can situate yourselves against your peers. Very importantly, as you know, we've been gathering data on the gender balance in our membership over the last few years, and as you can see, the guys and girls at OSCE have really put together nice presentations so we can see the percentage of staff there. So we still obviously have underrepresentation of women in leadership roles across the board, at a board level, at chairs, and also CEOs. I know it might be a little bit hard to see from a distance, but this will be up on our website next week. So I'd really encourage you to download it. It's a much, much bigger resource. We've done lobbying over the last few years, and of course the Gates Foundation with Save the Children have been taking politicians out to look at development projects, but we've got the participation in percentages in the report of who meets with us. So you'll see a predominance there still with Labor representatives in the House and the Senate, and then the Coalition and the National, the Greens and Independents, and we've got that also for participation in those SAVE trips. We've got a number of schools across the country engaging with development NGOs, and that was a real surprise to me, just the very high levels of engagement. But you can see 64% there, I think 64% in New South Wales, 74% in Victoria. I mean, like, that's very hopeful for the future if we're engaging the next generation of Australians in the schooling system. And then finally, our interactive map has all of your programs plugged into it country by country and shows how many Australian NGOs are there, what they're leveraging in terms of their community funding, Department of Foreign Affairs trade funding, and by sector. So I'd really encourage you to get onto our website and use that resource, and thank you for providing data to us each year, but this is how we're providing it back to you. Thank you to Raywin Lance and to from ACFID's Secretariat, who this was her, aside from National Conference this year, was a major project that she helped deliver with OSCE, our sponsors here at conference. Thank you, everybody.